Apologetics and other free thinkers on campus. We are affiliated to the Secular Student Alliance and Center for Inquiry here in Michigan and Michigan. We provide a community for non-religious students and allies at GVSU dedicated to promoting secularism in all aspects of life. We give non-theists a place to exchange ideas in an environment that is free from dogmatism, bigotry, and superstition. Offering everyone with secular values a place to contribute to the community out of kindness and compassion for humanity. Our goal is to promote scientific research, critical analysis, and secular values. If you're interested in what upcoming events we have for the rest of the semester, we have flyers available outside the back doors there. And after this event, we'll be gathering at Main Street Pub on 48th Lake, Michigan for some additional discussion and drinks afterwards. And without further delay, let me introduce our moderator for tonight, our President-elect, Caleb Templer.
Thank you, Ellen. That's kind of hot. As Ellen said, my name is Caleb Templer. I am a member of GVSA, and the question on tonight's docket for the debate is the question of the existence of God or a higher power. According to the Pew Research Center, the number of Americans who self-identify as religious has been dropping 5% for the last 5 years, although 1/5 of the current U.S. population today says that they are not affiliated with any particular religion. However, popularity is not necessarily an indicator of truth, and so tonight is not a popularity contest. We are looking to try and have some kind of serious and rational discussion about the existence of God, and you will likely agree or disagree with one or both of our speakers tonight. We ask that you refrain from booing, shouting, throwing food, etc. And we would like you to please silence or turn off your cell phones. While you probably have a few strong opinions on the subject, we would like you to keep your seats and refrain from speaking until the question and answer section of the debate, which will occur after both of our speakers, Scott and Justin, are finished with their presentations. So, with no further ado, I would like to introduce our two speakers, Scott Smith and Justin Schieber. Scott, who will be arguing for the existence of a God representing Christianity, is a founder and frequent speaker of an apologetics group in Traverse City. TCApologetics.org is where you can find more information about him. And he's also a tireless internet blogger at sarcasticxgen.com. Scott is well-versed in promoting a rational defense of his Christian faith as a comprehensive worldview to anyone with an open mind, and then arguing for the non-existence of a God. Justin Schieber, and he is an atheist who is going to be speaking tonight. Justin was raised a Christian until he endured a difficult 2-year crisis in the faith, his teens that led him to reject the claims of an evangelical Christian God. Currently, Justin enjoys promoting critical thought and a friendly yet firm skepticism towards religious claims. Justin is also a co-host at a local radio station, 95.3 FM WPRR, and the podcast Reasonable Doubts that can be found at doubtcast.org for more information. Gentlemen? Scott, you have 15 minutes.
Good evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening. In particular, I'd like to thank the Grand Valley Secular Alliance, and specifically Ellen Lundgren for setting this up. Thanks also to Justin for inviting me to this discussion. I appreciate the opportunity. I'd like to add to my introduction that I'm just an average guy. I have no formal training in logic or philosophy. I'm not a pastor or theologian. I'm just a guy who likes to read, likes to listen, have discussions. I've looked at the evidence, and I remain convinced. I'm not sure how many minds are ever changed by debates like this, but I think it's valuable to keep the conversation going. One thing is certain, this will not be settled tonight. God's existence or non-existence cannot be proven with certainty. That is the domain of things like math. When it comes to the existence of quarks, love, the theory of evolution, whether Elvis actually died, and the existence of God, We are dealing in probabilities. Like a detective or juror, we will be looking at the evidence and deciding which way the scales are leaning. What seems most likely? What is the simplest explanation? What is the least ad hoc? The question of God's existence has persisted for millennia, so I'm under no illusion that I'll settle the issue tonight. However, I do believe that there are sufficiently good reasons to believe in the existence of the Christian God, and there are not equally persuasive reasons to cause me to disbelieve. Tonight, I'm going to ask you to play the role of crime scene investigator. Regardless of which side you find most compelling, I'd ask that you listen with an open mind and do your best to listen to both Justin and me dispassionately. Don't look for either of us to lay out a mathematical proof that will end all discussion. There is no Pythagorean theorem for theism or atheism. Rather, we are each making an argument for what we find most persuasive. I'd ask you to listen to the case each lays out and keep a mental tally. Where does the evidence take you? I believe firmly that Christianity is an evidential religion. It is not an exercise in blind faith, but rather it is a set of claims we believe are true because that is where the evidence takes us. What is God? A classic definition for God is the greatest conceivable being. What is meant by greatest? For this we look to things called great-making properties. Things such as power, knowledge, and goodness. God, if he exists, would be a being who is maximally powerful, who possesses all knowledge, and personifies the very definition of moral goodness. Other properties that would characterize such a being are things like eternality, necessity, the ability to create from nothing, and existence apart from time, space, and matter. Which leads me to my first argument. The Kalam cosmological argument was first popularized over 1,000 years ago by Persian philosopher Al-Ghazali. It's a syllogistic argument, which means that if both premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. It goes like this. Premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Intuition and some simple reflection support this claim. Philosophy and science back this up as well. To suggest otherwise sounds more like magic than science. To dispute this premise would be to believe that dinosaurs could simply spring into existence in this room tonight without cause. But even the famous atheist philosopher David Hume accepts this premise, stating, "I never asserted so absurd a proposition that anything might arise without a cause." Premise 2. The universe began to exist. In an effort to sidestep this premise, some will claim that an infinite number of universes exist, or that an infinite amount of time has lapsed. Infinity is a useful concept for math, but there is no actual infinite. Imagine that your campus library contained an infinite number of red books, placed in an alternating fashion with an infinite number of blue books. What if I were to check out all of the red books? How many books would be left? We'd still have an infinite number. Remember, we started with an infinite number of blue books, and they remain on the shelves. So in this case, infinity minus infinity equals infinity. What if I removed all the books numbered 5 and up? How many would I have left then? In this case, I would have 5. So in this case, infinity minus infinity equals 5. Does it make sense to say that the number of red books is identical to the number of red books plus green books? If I were to say such a thing, if there were such a thing as an infinite universe, this is what you would have to say. So now, infinity equals 2 times infinity. Do you see the problem? When withdrawing an infinite number of books from our imaginary library, we can end up with 0 books, an infinite number of books, or any number in between. This is just one of the many illustrations which show the absurdity of the actual infinite. Infinity is a useful hypothetical when we are doing things like calculus. This is how we see the direction that things are trending when the sum is indefinite. But ask any math major and it will tell you that one never arrives at infinity, they simply approach it. The potential infinity is a useful idea, but the actual infinity is impossible. Since an actual infinity is absurd, the universe had a beginning. This century has brought the discovery of overwhelming evidence pointing to an event we refer to as the Big Bang. That the Big Bang happened is the nearly undisputed position of modern science. Professionals doing study in the field have noted that things like the expansion of the universe and background radiation point to there being a moment in history at which the universe was compressed into the space of a single point of unimaginable density. Prior to this moment, the universe did not exist. In fact, nothing existed. The Big Bang was the instant at which matter, time, and space itself came into being. The Big Bang is conclusive evidence that the universe had a beginning. The last piece of evidence I will offer in support of this premise is the second law of thermodynamics. This law talks about increasing entropy we see in closed systems such as our universe. To put it a bit more simply, the universe is approaching equilibrium. For a simple example, if you were to pour hot coffee into a cold mug, the coffee would cool slightly and the mug would warm. Given more time, the air around the mug of coffee would affect the temperature of both. This is an example of temperatures seeking equilibrium. Increasing entropy says that things will go from order to disorder. Given enough time, cars will rust out, planets will cease spinning, stars will stop burning, and eventually everything will come to a stop in an event called heat death. This is where the important part comes in. If the universe has built into it a fixed amount of entropy, then it also has a finite amount of time before reaching this heat death. But if the universe were past eternal, we would have reached that point by now. We are still here, so the age of the universe is finite. In other words, it began to exist. This second premise is not strictly a theist claim. The beginnings of the universe is accepted by the vast majority of scientists and philosophers. No less a mind than Stephen Hawking agrees that the universe had its beginning in the Big Bang. He has stated that he wishes the universe were eternal so that even the possibility of God could be ruled out. Famous chemist Peter Atkins and biologist Richard Dawkins, both atheists, also accept that the Big Bang singularity as the initiating event of the universe. And can we really disagree with atheist philosopher Kai Nielsen when he writes, "Suppose you suddenly hear a loud bang and you ask me, 'What made that bang?' And I reply, 'Nothing, it just happened.' You would not accept that. In fact, you would find my reply quite unintelligible. That the universe had a beginning is the consensus among leading atheists and theists as well. Based on these two premises, the necessary conclusion is that the universe has cause. I would add to that the cause of the universe must have whatever properties are required to bring the universe into existence. For example, the cause must be atemporal, that is, outside or independent of time as we understand it. The cause must be non-spatial, or outside of space as we understand it. The cause must be immaterial. The cause must exercise free choice, that is, be self-directing in its activity, and hence person, because persons decide to act. The cause must also be sufficiently powerful and intelligent to create a universe ex nihilo, which means from nothing with no raw materials. Any being that has these properties fits the definition of God. Therefore, the God of theism exists. Argument 2. The historical facts best correspond with the premise the Christian God exists. Everything I'm about to lay out in defense of this claim is agreed to by the large majority of scholars, both atheist and Christian. None of the following points appeal to the supernatural. All are considered historical bedrock. Point number 1. Jesus died by crucifixion. From 1st century documents alone, we have over a dozen accounts in which Jesus is mentioned. All attest to his existence, and most of them mention his death on a Roman cross. Point number 2. He was buried. Regardless of what happened to Jesus' body 3 days later, I think this one is a given. We have details about the tomb, its owner, people visiting it, and the later fact that it was empty. This requires a buried body. Point 3. His death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope. The primary eyewitness accounts record the disciples going into hiding and wondering what they would do next now that Jesus had been killed. Point 4. The tomb was empty. The Jewish authorities could have squelched the entire matter by producing the body. Instead, their defense was focused on blaming the disciples for stealing it. To suggest it was stolen requires an empty tomb. Point number 5. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. The Apostle Paul wrote a letter to the people in the church of Corinth. This letter is accepted as both ancient and authentically Pauline. In that letter, he recites a creed that he learned when he became a Christian. Even the most liberal of historians place this creed, or statement of beliefs, no later than 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. This creed includes a summary of bodily appearances by Jesus after his death. Many of the people who saw him are named, practically begging skeptics to visit them and investigate. Point number 6. The disciples were transformed from doubters to bold proclaimers. These same people who had been cowering in the shadows abruptly began to seek out public venues in which to preach about Jesus, earning them imprisonment, beatings, and ultimately their death. Point number 7. The resurrection was the central message. Remember, Jesus was not the first guy to come along claiming to be the Messiah, and he was certainly not the first to die for that claim. The disciples were afraid and hid because they thought this Messiah had failed too. They were not expecting to see him again. Resurrection was not a conspiracy by New Testament writers, nor was it created in Nicaea. These are popular claims that are easily debunked. The earliest messages preached the resurrection as the main event. There is no dispute that the bodily resurrection of Jesus was the central message from the early days of the church. Point number 8. They preached the message of Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was ground zero. That's where Jesus died and was buried. If there was a body in the tomb, you can bet it would have been presented by the Jewish or Roman leaders. Point number 9. The church was born and grew. The Christian church went from non-existence to overnight becoming one of the largest and fastest growing organizations in history. One that still exists 2,000 years later and remains the world's largest religion. Point 10. Orthodox Jews who believed in Christ made Sunday their primary day of worship. These are people that structured their schedules, their actions, their diets, and nearly every other aspect of their life according to religious laws for fear of the wrath of God. Yet once hearing the gospel message, they abandoned their holy day and worshiped Jesus as God. Point number 11. James was converted to the faith when he saw the resurrected Jesus. James not only abandoned his Jewish faith, as I mentioned, but did so because he believed his brother was God. I don't know about you, but that would be a tall order for me. Not only did James become a Christian, but he led the church at ground zero, Jerusalem. Not only that, but he paid for it by being stoned to death. Sounds like a guy who was convinced that the brother he grew up with actually was God. Point 12, lastly, Paul was converted to the faith. Paul was a Jew as well, one of the most stringent and well-trained. He was an outsider. He did not follow Jesus around like the disciples did. He was a skeptic and a critic who wanted to shut down this religious uprising. He actually asked for the assignment to track down Christians and put an end to their practices. He was familiar with their beliefs, and after a solitary event, Paul changed from chief skeptic and persecutor to chief apologist and preacher. As I mentioned at the outset, these facts are virtually undisputed. Therefore, they count as evidence. Just as in the courtroom, we need to consider this evidence and see what explanation best fits the facts. I submit that the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation of this evidence. In review, I have presented two arguments to support my case. The first argues for the existence of a personal God, and the second puts forward the claim that Jesus was that God. Argument 1 was the Kalam cosmological argument, which says, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. I continue to argue that based on the criteria that describe this cause, the cause must be God. Argument 2 comprised 12 broadly accepted facts surrounding the events following Jesus' death. I then propose the hypothesis that offers that the best explanation is that Jesus was God. Together, I contend that these arguments make the existence of the Christian God very likely. Given these and all other similar arguments, I believe that the Christian God exists. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Justin, please.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. Let me begin by thanking Ellen Lundgren and the Grand Valley Secular Alliance for hosting and inviting me to participate in tonight's debate. I also want to express my appreciation to Scott Smith for his participation as well. I'm often asked why it is that I spend time promoting secularism and criticizing people's deeply held religious beliefs. But this question has always confused me. After all, don't we find ourselves on a planet with other beings who act according to their beliefs? Shouldn't we care that those humans take responsibility for their beliefs? Shouldn't we care that they have good reasons for the beliefs that they hold? After all, it's those beliefs that affect all of us. They affect who someone votes for to represent all of us in public office. They will affect the quality of the information that we are passing on to the children of the next generation. And they also affect what causes that they funnel money and other valuable resources towards, and how they treat groups and individuals of ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities. It's very clear that we must start to take people's beliefs very seriously. We must not be afraid to criticize popular beliefs. Now, in tonight's debate, I'm being asked to defend two claims. First, that there are very strong reasons for thinking that the Christian God does not exist. And second, that there are not very strong reasons for thinking that the Christian God does exist. And I want to briefly sketch two philosophical arguments in support of my first contention. First, the very existence of the universe provides us with very strong reasons for thinking that God does not exist. I'm willing to bet that nobody here seriously doubts that the universe exists. The reality of the universe and the objects within it are just too obvious to deny. I'm also willing to bet that the theists in this room believe that God is absolutely perfect, both morally and ontologically. So what is meant by this? There are things called great-making properties, as Scott has already said, things like power, being loving, and having knowledge. And God has all of these properties to their maximal degree. The words of Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland can help shed some light upon this. He says that, quote, to say that God is perfect means that there's no possible world where he has his attributes to a greater degree. God is not the most loving being that happens to exist. Rather, he is the most loving being that could possibly exist. So that God's possessing the attribute of being loving is to a degree such that it is impossible for him to have it to a greater degree. So the question that I want to ask us tonight is, if the Christian God were to exist, would he actually have reasons to create the universe? The theist, of course, has no options here. He must answer yes, because after all, the universe clearly does exist. However, I want to argue that the answer to this question is no. The argument involves the phrase divine Trinitarian solipsism. I take this phrase to refer to that possible world where God exists alone and nothing else exists for eternity. In other words, it's a possible world where God never actually creates anything. That is a possibility. Of course, theists believe that that is not the actual world, but they believe that this is a possible world. So here's the argument. Premise one, if the Christian God exists, then divine Trinitarian solipsism is the best possible world. Premise two, if divine Trinitarian solipsism is the best possible world, then the Christian God would maintain divine Trinitarian solipsism. Premise three, divine Trinitarian solipsism is false because the universe exists. Conclusion, therefore, the Christian God, as so defined, does not exist. Now this is a valid, deductive argument, the conclusion of which follows inescapably from the premises. So to rationally deny the conclusion, you need to deny one or more of the premises. Hopefully the dichotomy is clear here. Something has to give. You either deny the existence of the universe, or you deny the Christian conception of God. That is my first argument. But let us now suppose that my argument has a way out of this dilemma. Let us suppose that we're given a reason to doubt my argument and to think that God would have reasons to create a universe despite being perfect. If that is the case, then he has to deal with my second argument. And this argument is not concerned with whether or not God would ever create a universe. Rather, this one is concerned with what kind of universe God would create if he had reasons to create. And so for my second argument, the existence of evil constitutes strong evidence for atheism. In Uganda, an organized gang of chimpanzees inflicts extreme violence on another lone chimp who has wandered into their territory. They close in with a screaming frenzy, biting, kicking, and inflicting powerful blows, causing horrific injury to the immobilized chimp, until at last nature shows a bit of sympathy and allows him to die after several minutes of pure, horrifyingly unimaginable torture. Now, thanks to University of Michigan primate behavioral ecologist John Mattini and his 10-year study of a chimp community in Uganda, we now have definitive evidence that bands of chimpanzees violently kill individuals from neighboring groups in order to expand their own territory and to secure additional resources. Even isolated instances of cannibalism have been observed. Now, there's very little difference between chimpanzees and humans and the other great apes. Chimpanzees, our closest cousins, are highly intelligent social animals and are especially sensitive to physical and emotional pain. Like humans, they exhibit a range of emotions, including pleasure, deep depression, pain, empathy, and grief. Why would a loving God allow such horrific instances of suffering to occur? In 1983, Charles Rothenberg kidnaps his 6-year-old son David after losing a custody battle with his ex-wife. One night, while David slept, his father Charles doused his body in kerosene. Now, David has third-degree burns on 90% of his body. Why would a God allow this if he was loving? If God is all-knowing, he must know about these evils before they even occur. If God is all-powerful, he could easily prevent them. And if God is all-good, it sure seems that he would want to prevent them. Otherwise, what does it mean to be good? But I want to give the Christian God a bit of a break here. After all, we do have a bit of a history. I'm perfectly willing to grant that God may have reasons for allowing certain evils to occur in the actual world. After all, it seems plausible that if God exists, God may have reasons for allowing some evils to ensure some greater good to occur. But, and this is important, God would never allow evil God would never allow a specific instance of evil unless it was logically necessary for the actualization of some greater good. God would never allow unnecessary evils. But many of these evils, both in number and degree, seem like they have no justification in the form of some greater good. Many of these evils seem like God could have easily prevented them without losing out on some greater good. I think that this fact should lead a rational person to say that probably some evils aren't just confusing, mysterious, or inscrutable, but that some evils are actually gratuitous and unnecessary evils. Evils that God would prevent if he did exist. And so to the degree that such gratuitous evils do exist, to that degree, God probably doesn't. So the argument is as follows. Many evils seem gratuitous, for premise 1. Premise 2 is that probably some evils are gratuitous. Premise 3, if God exists, God would not permit any gratuitous evils. Conclusion, therefore, God probably does not exist. Now you may be thinking, hold on there. You can't go from the mere fact that there are many evils that seem to be gratuitous and unnecessary to the claim that probably some are gratuitous and unnecessary. However, I disagree. I think that we make these kinds of inductive inferences all the time, and we are perfectly rational in doing so. Suppose that after rummaging around carefully in my fridge, I can't seem to find a carton of milk. Unfortunately, a fairly regular occurrence at my house. Naturally enough, though, I infer that probably there isn't one there. Nobody would say that this kind of inference is irrational. In the same way, if some evils are such that it is incredibly difficult to find even a possible justifying reason for God to permit them, we have very good reason to think that probably there is no reason for God to permit them. Probably they are gratuitous and unnecessary evils. But God certainly would not allow such evils, and so if they probably exist, to that degree, God probably doesn't. Now the theist has options available to him, of course. He could deny my inference from premise 1 to premise 2 and say that we're simply not in a good position to make such probability claims about what God would allow because our scope is so limited compared to God's. It's possible that given our limited perspective, we only see a small portion of the goods that actually exist. And so we shouldn't really expect to be able to find God's justifying reasons for permitting the things that he does. Remember my fridge analogy? This approach rejects the fridge analogy as a false analogy. They would say, of course, we are warranted in concluding that probably no milk was in the fridge, but that's only because we should expect to be able to see it if it was there. If we had poor eyesight, they would say, then of course we would not be justified in making such an inference, because we wouldn't really expect to be able to see it if it was there. In the same way, given our limited ability to see God's justifying reasons, we're simply not in a position to infer that such reasons probably don't exist. Now, this view, I think, is just extraordinarily implausible. And so, in the words of philosopher Robert Bass of UNC, evil counts against the existence of God, just as crabgrass on the golf green counts against the existence of an efficient greenskeeper. Now, if Scott wants us to believe in the Christian God, he must first tear down both of my arguments and defend his arguments from the criticisms which we'll hear shortly. Unless and until he does this, I think that atheism is the more plausible position to take on the serious question of whether the Christian God exists. Thank you very much.
We'll have 8 minutes to do a first rebuttal.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the thought that Justin's put into this. Arguments such as he has presented are much more reasonable and worthy of discussion than the bombs that are typically lobbed online. To his specific arguments, his argument from the universe, his premise, if the Christian God exists, then divine Trinitarian solipsism is the best possible world. I'm not sure that there's any reason to believe this to be true. Why presume that there is a best possible world? I'm not sure that applies. What is the best possible circle? Maximal roundness? Sufficient smoothness? Ideal radius? Isn't it possible that all circles, which are equally round, are all best? What is the best possible tree? A maple? A pine? A tall tree? A wide one? Is it not possible that there are many excellent trees which could even rise to the level of perfection, yet be different? If trees and circles don't have a single objective criterion by which to establish them as best, why presume a world which contains all these things could? Premise 2, if divine Trinitarian solipsism is the best possible world, then the Christian God will maintain that. I see no reason to accept premise 1, so this premise, in my opinion, is moot. Premise 3, divine Trinitarian solipsism is false because the universe exists. I think there's an implicit problem with this premise. The hidden premise is that anything God creates ought to be seen as a liability. I don't think this is a justified assumption. If God is maximally great, and creation ex nihilo, is from nothing, is one of those great-making properties, how can the expression of that power be seen as a negative? In my book, any being that can create something from literally nothing is a force to be reckoned with, without regard to what he actually creates. In addition, by that definition, God cannot create something equal to himself. If he did, he would no longer be maximal. Additionally, he is uncreated. He is the only thing that is uncreated. Therefore, anything that he creates would be less perfect than he. So either he creates something less than himself, or he is a creative being that can't create. And that does not sound to me like a greatest possible being. Certainly not God. His conclusion, therefore the Christian God is so defined doesn't exist. The conclusion may be valid, but it's not sound, because I believe all 3 previous points are moot. Beyond that, I think there are overwhelming reasons to see the existence of the universe as proof of God. To see it as a liability is an unusual and unsupportable view, in my opinion. I can also respond by reframing the argument. Premise 1, a maximal being is able to create the best possible world. Premise 2, God has created an actual world. Premise 3, it is possible that the actual world is the best possible world. And remember, we're dealing with probabilities here. Or as Leibniz has offered, since God's will is perfect, and he has willed this world is the best possible world. Another option, when describing a best possible world, numerous options seem plausible, based on who is describing what is meant by best. Therefore, the definition of best seems subjective and personal. Premise 2, God is a personal being, and his preferences would surpass all other preferences. Premise 3, therefore any world created by God would be a best possible world. Also, I see no reason to presume that God must actualize a perfect world all in one step. What prevents an eternal being from creating a world that is made perfect over time. This is the Christian view. God has chosen to exercise his prerogative to actualize the best possible world on his own timeline. Who are we to say that this plan is not best? On Justin's evidential problem of evil, first premise, many evils seem gratuitous. We're simply not in any position to assess whether God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils that occur. Additionally, one has to believe that morals are objective, evil is real, and greater goods mean greater perfections. What are the definitions of these words? What is evil? What is good? On Christianity, these terms make sense. For an atheist to make these statements, it seems you're trading on currency borrowed from our worldview. On atheism, this premise seems to be a critique of a God that does not exist using terms that don't have definitions. If not finding the logical basis for the existence of something were sufficient criteria, we would all be stuck in solipsism. Honestly, we don't have any logical basis to state with any degree of certainty that we are not bugs dreaming of being human. Premise 2, probably some evils are gratuitous. Again, what is good and what makes it greater? And why must it obtain? Why is God under any obligation to obtain one thing and avoid another, for which, again, atheism has no definition? Premise 3 was if God exists, God would not permit any gratuitous evils. To make this claim, Justin would have to prove that there is no morally sufficient reason, which he cannot. Even William Rowe, who made this argument famous, admits to this. A philosopher once said that when he was a boy, he used to go fishing all the time with his older brother. Then one day it all stopped. He had no way to explain this problem of evil in his life until he discovered birds. You see, it's very conceivable that there is a greater good which we are not in a position to know currently. The claim that God would not permit any gratuitous evils is an assertion without any basis. I don't think we're in a position to know what God would or would not do. Actually, the Christian faith involves doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and evil. Some examples. On Christianity, the chief purpose of life is not happiness, but knowledge of God. Example 2, Jesus said we would have trouble. Number 3, a pain-free life on earth is not our goal. Paul refers to this troubled life on earth as momentary light afflictions. On Christianity, this world is not the best possible world. A much better world was given and has been promised. Earth is not a terrarium for God's pets. We were made for another world, but for now we're here. Justin's conclusion to this argument was probably God does not exist. To say that God probably does not exist is worlds apart from saying that God does not exist. Not knowing is different from knowing. Consider a child raised by his family in their cabin in the woods. For him to say, as far as I've been able to tell, there is nothing on earth beyond this forest, is a very different thing than saying, there is nothing on earth beyond this forest. Probability statements are made relative to all the evidence, not just that which is in view. For example, I can say that the probability of rain is very low based on the weather forecast. However, if it is actually raining outdoors, my assessment of the probabilities is worthless. When all the evidence is in view, the problem of evil is insufficient to meet the challenge. When looking at things like the origin of the universe, the origin of humanity, the origin of consciousness, the origin of morality, God's existence is probable. The problem of evil poses a problem, to be sure, but not just for the Christian. David Hume famously asked what the Christian would say at the bedside of a dying child. But I would reverse the question. What can the atheist say? Tough luck? Your number's up? Time to enter into non-existence? To be fair, this is an issue we all have to deal with. It's an empty challenge, in my opinion, that we all have to deal with, but only Christianity has a satisfactory resolution to the problem.
Thank you, Scott.
In his opening statement, Scott provided us with two arguments. Let's look at them in order. Kalam cosmological argument, God as the cause of the universe. First, it should be said that the traditional view has always been that the Christian God is timeless in the sense of being outside of time. Now, the Big Bang is really the beginning of time itself, a view that I'm suspicious of, but that Scott accepts. then the cause, of course, must be non-temporal, and Scott agrees. So we have two options here. A non-temporal personal cause, a timeless personal cause, or a timeless impersonal cause. So which is it? Well, I think that to answer this question, we can look at what it actually means for personal causes to cause events intentionally, or with a free choice, as Scott has said. Personal causes can cause events in two different ways. Personal causes can have an intention to change states of affairs and to maintain states of affairs. So under changing states of affairs, the intention must be temporally prior to both the beginning to act to bring changes about and the actualization of those changes. Now, of course, the intention to maintain states of affairs, the intention could be simultaneous with the changes it wants to maintain. So we have three moments here. Agent intends space-time to exist, agent beginning to act to bring space-time about, and space-time being fully actualized. There needs to be a temporal relation between all three of these steps. They can't be simultaneous with each other, otherwise it would abandon what it means to actually act intentionally. And so you cannot have a timeless personal creator of time itself, because intentional causes presuppose a pre-existing context of time to take place in. And so the Kalam cosmological argument, when coupled with what it actually means for personal agents to cause events intentionally, is actually an argument against a timeless personal creator of the universe. Let's move on to the resurrection argument Scott provided. Scott appeals to facts that the majority of scholars hold to. But should anybody really be surprised that the vast majority of New Testament scholars who decided to spend much of their time in deep study of the issues surrounding Jesus might have favorable views of the religion in which he serves as a central figure? Of course not. What should surprise us is if this wasn't the case. Not to mention the fact that there are Christian schools out there where denial of the resurrection will get you fired. So the mere majority agreement among scholars, the mere majority agreement among scholars is simply not licensed to presume these facts as our base assumptions for which an explanation is required. That doesn't, of course, mean that I can dismiss these either. It means that we need arguments for these tonight. Scott knows that the empty tomb is the least agreed upon by scholars. Only something like 75% of scholars have studied it. Now, if this is supposed to be taken as historical fact, then the debate is over. Because then the most recent philosophical survey shows that roughly 73% of philosophers are atheists, should lead us to think that atheism is a philosophical fact. Now, Scott, of course, is arguing that the best explanation of these supposed historical facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And he's not alone on this. On page 222 of Lee Strobel's A Case for Christ, William Lane Craig is quoted as saying, any hypothesis would be more probable than saying that the corpse of Jesus spontaneously came back to life. But, he says, the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead doesn't contradict science or any known facts of experience. And listen to what he says here. This is important. All it requires is the hypothesis that God exists, and I think that there are good independent reasons for believing that he does. And I think I can largely agree with Craig here on this specific point, because as an atheist, of course, any wild and far-fetched naturalistic explanation is going to be a better explanation than the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. So I'm well within my intellectual rights to not find the positive theistic explanation as a good explanation, because for anybody to assign some hypothesis as the best explanation of some pool of data, they must recognize that look, this assignment is largely going to be a function of whether it fits well with an individual's background knowledge or their theory of the world. And so in the absence of any independent compelling reasons for thinking that a God exists, and absent any reasons to think that it is far more likely that God, if he did exist, would raise a first-century Palestinian Jew rather than a first-century Mayan Mesoamerican, this resurrection argument is going to be a fairly weak one. I'm not saying, of course, that this argument does not constitute some evidence for Christianity at all. I'm only saying that it fails as strong evidence for Christianity, the kind that would be required for a fair-minded atheist to rationally change his mind on the subject. However, I want to show that there is actually a better explanation than what Scott has provided. I want to claim that better explanation is that some unknown person or persons broke into the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea and stole the body of Jesus. The followers of Jesus were well familiar with this imminent apocalyptic message, and the Jews at this time believed in a general resurrection of the righteous dead at the end of the age. So a resurrection would have been practically expected. Following the horrific death of their religious leader and the discovery of the empty tomb, from it being robbed, perhaps a tragedy-stricken leader of the remaining group had a vision, a hallucination of Jesus that he interpreted as a risen physical Jesus. And so through suggestion and false memory recall, others might come to believe that actually they had a vision too. Maybe they dreamt of something at a certain time of the day that they had a difficult time telling whether that was a real physical vision or not. So this is just one possible explanation, and I think it's a better one because it doesn't appeal to supernatural things. And we all generally we all have good reasons to prefer a natural explanation over a supernatural one because we do it every single day. So at the end of the day, though, the overall explanation that Mr. Smith is proposing for this collection of historical facts, some questionable and some not, is largely a function of the strength of the overall theistic hypothesis, which would have such a specific resurrection of that person in that time and place follow as a matter of common course. Which, if I've done my job, ladies and gentlemen, is not one that you should find particularly persuasive. Thank you very much.
All right, we will now have the second round of rebuttals. These will consist of 2 5-minute segments.
I think Justin's trying to see how fast I can write. Let's see, I will try and address some of the issues that he raised as I can remember them and read my writing. First of all, Justin contended that the scholars that I referenced are basically ringers for Christianity. This is not the case. This is across the board. Historians who have a job and have degrees, whether atheist or theist, believe and agree to these 12 minimal facts, as they're called. This is well documented. It's true that the fact that the tomb was empty is the most contested of the facts. However, even that one is agreed to by 75% of the scholars. Additionally, merely saying that these facts are not so does not explain them, and Justin conceded that. They still have to be dealt with. And I will address some of those in a minute. Justin also made the contention that natural arguments ought to be preferred over supernatural. I would ask why, or natural explanations, I should say. Why ought supernatural explanations automatically be preferred over supernatural? I see no reason to support this. I would have to be given reasons to believe that to be true. If we are going to be tolerant, open-minded scientists who are looking at all facts, you can't go in with presuppositions that you believe are true or untrue. If we want to do fair history and science, we do it with an open mind. As to the specifics that Justin mentioned, the hypothesis he had for the resurrection, let's look at the suggestion that he made. The disciples broke in and they stole Jesus' body. Remember, anywhere from several years to 50 years after this, all of them died for this belief. Many martyrs have religion, or many religions have martyrs. And while it's true that many people will die for something that they sincerely believe, it's a much different thing to die for something you know to be false because you are complicit in fabricating it. You would have to come up with other examples where you would know this to be true. People who conspired to lie about something, hid the facts, had nothing to gain from it, and then underwent beatings, torture, beheading, crucifixion, and nobody fessed up. I think that's implausible. Justin mentioned they expected a bodily resurrection. There's no reason to believe that. On Judaism, this is why they were so shocked. This is why no one understood Jesus' message when he was speaking in parable and allegory. And this is why the disciples went into hiding after he died. They thought he had followed a long trail of martyrs and died and failed. They didn't expect him to come back to life because that notion of bodily resurrection was foreign to Judaism. Justin mentioned perhaps that these appearances they had were a group hallucination. The problem is that doesn't happen. We see individual hallucination, dreams, visions, things like that. But you'd have to explain away what Paul mentions of a group of 500 people seeing Jesus at one time. You'd have to explain all these other scenarios that are described in the Bible. Specifically, in Corinthians, Galatians, some of the books that are uncontested as being Pauline and ancient. Presumably, and I think this is another big difficulty for Justin's alternate explanation, presumably the disciples hid Jesus away, stashed him away, gave him some water because he was probably exhausted after being tortured to death. If you've seen the movies or read anything on what actually happens in crucifixion, it's brutal. So this view that Justin has presented would require you to believe the disciples took a man who had been beaten within inches of his life, whom all the people that were undergoing this form of execution believed was dead, that he came, was hidden away somewhere, and somehow a few days later was presented to other people as being a conquering king. This is not someone who looks like a conquering king if somebody appears in this kind of shape. Let's see. The fact is we're not limited just to probabilities. We have to look at the 12 facts that I laid out and see what best fits them. Let me ask you this, based on Justin's claim of naturalism, based on prior probabilities alone, in 1950, if it were suggested to you that a man would walk on the moon, wouldn't that fail to be persuasive? Basically, all this objection says is that things are considered impossible until they happen. Thanks.
Okay, Scott objects to my problem of evil by saying that actually evil is more of a problem for atheism. But of course this response fails to see that the problem of evil that I have presented can easily be run as a reductio, an internal critique of Christianity, and doesn't depend in any way upon whatever particular views the person has that is presenting you. This assumption here, of course, is that atheism somehow can't account for moral realism, the reality of good and evil. I don't think this is the case, but maybe it's true. But of course, if moral realism is false, then so is theism, as Scott understands it. I have the option of denying moral realism, and Scott doesn't. So either moral realism is true, in which case you actually need to deal with the problem of evil, or it's false and God doesn't exist. So as far as I can tell, I win either way. Scott can't afford to take his own objections seriously here. Now, in response, further in his response to the problem of evil, he says that Christians should embrace a kind of attitude of skepticism about what God would or wouldn't do. This position is called skeptical theism. After all, we lowly creatures do not have epistemic access to the vast portion of goods that exist, and so if this is the case, we simply can't say whether God creating an entire universe having so much gratuitous evil, or apparent gratuitous evil, whether it's justified or not. Unfortunately, though, adopting this position as a response to the problem of evil, his other arguments suffer irreparable collateral damage. I may have just won the debate. For instance, the Kalam. This makes my criticism of Kalam even stronger. It makes the theistic hypothesis an absolutely terrible explanation of the universe existing. We're simply not in a good position to say whether God would or wouldn't create a universe. So how can we say that God is an explanation for the existence of it? This is also extremely damaging to his resurrection argument. Scott can no longer say that the probability of the resurrection, given theism, is high or low or medium. He simply has to remain a completely agnostic on this, because he simply doesn't have access to all those goods that God would be motivated to act towards. Skeptical theism makes it even more damaging to basic Christian doctrine. Eric Wielenberg argues that this position implies that we can't actually know any proposition that is justified only through biblical text alone. So this is, of course, nearly all of Christian doctrine. Well, why is this? Because God may have morally sufficient reasons for lying to us, reasons that we simply don't have epistemic access to. So the fact that we cannot think of a justification for God lying to us in the biblical text, that the entire Bible is wrong, the fact that we can't think of a justification for his lying doesn't mean that God doesn't have reasons to lie to us in the biblical text. Now, of course, one might appeal to the biblical text itself and say that the biblical text says that God cannot lie, but of course that would be begging the question. So I don't see how Scott's case can survive at all after this. After we take the position of skeptical theism, the debate is largely over. So now he has concerns with the hypothesis that I raised for the resurrection. Who stole the body and why? We need to have a motive. We need to have people that could have done such a thing. Well, we have strong evidence that in first century Palestine, tomb robbery was a widespread problem. Bodies and body parts were valuable for necromancy. They were used for casting spells and things like this. The body of the supposed holy man, of course, would have been even more valuable in these practices. Also, the tomb belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, a man of wealth, and a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. For all they knew, there was much to be had in that tomb. So they stole the body, and they would have had legitimate reasons, there were real reasons to do such a thing at such a time. Or, here's another possibility, perhaps one of... Oh, I'm sorry, I was hearing things. So another possibility is that perhaps one of Jesus' followers was eager to restore his good name and teachings despite being crucified like a common criminal. Perhaps this individual thought that, as long as the others believed that that he actually conquered death and was taken up and vindicated by God, then that might be the only way that Jesus' teachings might survive and be preserved for the future generations. Sure, he would have had to engage in a little bit of pious deceit, but that's a very small price to pay for what really matters to him, the continuation of Jesus' moral teachings. So I do think there are good reasons, and there are very good people to be able to do so.
Thank you, Justin. We will now enter the closing statements. I would like to remind you that we will be having a question and answer session once the two closing statements are done. I would like you to please prepare a one-sentence question that you can ask that would be possibly followed up by any additional information. Or, well, yeah, there's something that's tangible that we can have our two debaters answer easily. Well, maybe not easily, but... All right, 2 minutes.
The problem of evil, put concisely, says that the pain and evil that exists in the world, or it says that given the pain and evil that exists in the world, either God lacks power or he doesn't care. I don't think this argument goes through. Hopefully I've presented some alternatives for you to think about. I'd like to point out something else in closing. When looking at the issue of God's existence, we have to look at the whole picture. There are a number of arguments for God in addition to those I've presented. Additionally, when critiquing the Christian worldview, we have to look at the whole picture, not just a single aspect that seems troubling in isolation. Christianity does not describe a God that is powerless or uncaring. Christianity says the opposite. It says that he cared so much that he entered into the very system Justin is criticizing. If God does not care about the human condition, tell me, what was he doing in a human body hanging on a cross? And if God lacks power, what was the process that brought about the resurrection? The Christian view is that the world is imperfect, but it will be made perfect. There is pain, but it will end. God is both powerful and caring, and he can be known. Christianity does not tell us to blindly follow an unknowable God. It invites us to examine the evidence. If you're a good investigator, you can't be selective with your evidence. Your task is to assess the plausibility of an explanation given all the evidence. And if one answer does the job, you ought to prefer that explanation. Is it possible that one person broke into a family's house and ran off, only to be followed by another person who carried away their belongings, who was then scared away by another attacker who came to assault the homeowners? Possible? Sure. Plausible? No. If a single suspect can be shown to fit all the evidence, that simpler option is to be preferred. So what is the atheist answer for the origins of the universe, or the facts surrounding Jesus' resurrection, or any of the other issues? Thank you.
Let's review the arguments that were presented tonight. There were 4 total arguments. Scott gave Kalam in the resurrection as an argument. However, I think that these fail once he responds to my evidential problem of evil with an attitude of skepticism about he has really no real reason to think that God would do a particular thing over any other particular thing. If we can't know, if we can't have the correct account of the good, then we simply can't know what God, if he did exist, what he would do. Given that, we can't say that God is an explanation of the existence of the universe any more than God is an explanation for why I found my car keys under my couch cushion tonight. So I don't think that the Kalam argument is successful for the reasons I suggested, that a personal cause has to act within a context of time. It can't be a creator of time. He also criticized my hypothesis for the resurrection by saying that such hallucinations aren't really possible. But of course, we don't have... he says that the 500 witnesses, of course, would be a problem for my hypothesis. But the tendency of strange subjective experiences being eventually recorded as real happenings being witnessed by a group is not at all uncommon. You don't have to take my word for it. You can look at the narratives of the conversion of Constantine recorded by Eusebius and Lactantius. Eusebius claims that he's getting information straight from Constantine, and Constantine tells us that the battle at Melbourne Bridge, his entire army saw a cross in the sky and a voice saying, "Conquer by this." But then Lactantius, was a contemporary of Eusebius, says that Constantine was directed by the same cross and voice in a dream the night before. So it's not at all uncommon for dreams or personal visions to be recorded historically as groups of large events, and so I don't think that his arguments work.
Both Justin and Scott for your rousing debates and arguments. If there's any questions from the audience, we have a microphone set up front.
I don't know one of the ones.
Yeah.
Earlier in the debate, you mentioned that supernatural explanations should be given equal credence as natural explanations. So, if a door slams in a house, should you give equal credence to the explanation that ghost did it, or maybe it was a pressure differential? How can you explain that?
Fair question. I think what Paul is intending to say is that we ought not dismiss supernatural evidence before examining the evidence. In your example, yeah, if there's a pressure differential in the house, I'm going with the wind did it. I'm just saying that we need to be open to all sorts of evidence. And certainly in many cases, maybe most cases, natural evidence will supply the most satisfactory answer.
I totally agree. I don't think that supernatural explanations should be dismissed a priori. That is not a claim that I made. I would say that we should, and I think everyone does, prefer naturalistic explanations over the supernatural ones.
Scott, in your opening statement, you argue with the cosmological argument that the cause of the universe is a personal one, is a deity. What reason do you have for a intelligent personal being versus a much simpler cause? I mean, it's postulated that it's actually more stable, more entropic for there to be something, for there to be a universe than nothing. Why do you say it has to be an intelligent being?
At the end, did you say that it ought to be, we ought to expect a universe? Did you say that? That is more likely than not?
I'm sorry, there's been some argument that having something is more stable than nothing, and that would be one alternative explanation for a cause. So I'm wondering why you claim a cause of the universe would be a personal, intelligent deity.
Good question. As far as something existing rather than nothing, because it's more stable, that may be a contention, but that's not a cause. That someone believing that has just made an observation about what is more stable. They haven't said anything about what is the causal agent there. As to the first part of your question, you asked why it would be personal. My reason for going to that is to say, obviously there was a beginning. The universe, there was a moment when the universe came to be, and prior to that, whatever prior to means, without time. But before that moment, the universe didn't exist. For something to go from nothing to something, or off to on, requires a cause, requires an agent, requires a decision to be made and an action to be taken. Only persons perform actions. That's my reason for calling it a personal being.
For you as well, and I'll just read it. In light of your reliance upon the Scripture in forming a framework wherein, and a foundation whereupon, morality may objectively be known, what internal ecclesiological mechanism do humans have to resort to when deep and significant moral differences derived from diverse interpretations of the text occur by devout and scholarly theologians? In short, with all the diversity of opinion on deep moral issues in the Bible, in application and in interpretation, what mechanism striving to protect objectivity can you rely upon other than simply you and your personal belief in that interpretation of the text?
Are you saying this as a challenge to the fact that there is an objective morality? Is that your basis?
Yes, well, I'm saying if standing upon your foundation and your insistence that there is an objective morality based on the interpretation and application of God's Word, the question is, in light of the vast diversity of scholarly opinion by devout people that you would recognize as Christians, what internal mechanism do you have to decide between one interpretation and another, or in the end, in practice, are you simply on no better footing than somebody that doesn't have your claim to objectivity? Thank you.
Sure. That's a lot. Good questions. I would say I'm not claiming that I possess objectivity, and I'm not claiming that I possess all knowledge. All I'm claiming is that there's a lot of feedback. I'm just claiming that there exists an objective morality. I'll happily admit that I'm not aware of all of how that plays out. I have plenty of incorrect opinions, I'm sure. But to say that no one possesses all information about truth isn't to say that truth doesn't exist. Over the centuries, while math theorems and postulates have been developed, no one would say that until the relationship of a circle's area to its radius had something to do with something called pi, no one would say that pi didn't exist as a relationship prior to that. So all I'm saying is that there is an objective moral basis that I believe is rooted in God. That gets a simple explanation. And just that people have different apprehension of it or different abilities to access it or understand it, that's not a liability of the view. It just means that we're imperfect beings.
Scott, another question for you. If we were to accept your proposition that the idea of infinity is absurd, then why is the idea of a place outside of time not absurd? And in your first rebuttal, you described God as an eternal being. Why is that not synonymous with an absurd being?
I mean, to make sure I understand it right, are you equating in some sense God's eternality with infinity?
Yes.
Playing those against each other?
Well, I would say that eternal is infinite.
Sure.
Yes.
I don't think that's the case. A few reasons. For one, as far as God existing outside of time, the basis I would give for that, if God is, as Anselm said, not Anselm, sorry, if he is the greatest maximal being, greatest possible being, then one of the things that would entail is necessity and existing outside, not being dependent on time, not being dependent on space and matter, those sorts of things. That's where I would get the contention that God exists outside of time. And if the Big Bang is true, meaning not only matter but space and time also came to be at the instant of the Big Bang, if God were the cause of that, he would have to be outside of time because that's when time began. That's how I would answer that part. As far as the eternal versus infinite, I would say that there is a difference between the two. When I'm talking about an actual infinity, we're talking about a set of numbers that includes all numbers and goes to infinity, which we can't even conceive what that actually is. Eternity is something different. If we talk about, say, the Christian view says that those who place their trust in Christ go to heaven and live eternally. That's not to say that they're infinite beings. All of us here were born. So at any moment, from the time we were born until any moment in eternity, in heaven, whatever that outside of earth existence is, we had a beginning. So our existence will be finite. It will be future eternal, but it will be finite. Only God goes infinitely in the past and the future. So he would be an eternal being.
So is there no eternal life?
Yes, there is eternal life. However, on Christianity, eternal life, the only distinction I'm making is that eternal life begins, our eternal life happens after our temporal life, and temporal life certainly has a beginning. So eternal life is a finite amount of time. It continues forever, however, it will always be countable.
Okay, thank you.
Scott, you have a... Yeah, so this issue has been brought up by philosopher Wes Morriston, who argues that, okay, let's assume that actual infinites are impossible. Well, under that assumption, as he rightly pointed out, then you have to deny the idea of an actual afterlife, because an afterlife is a sequence, an infinite sequence of numbered events. So you could say, well, Scott and Justin take turns praising God back and forth. He can take the even numbers of praises, I can take the odd numbers of praises. The question to ask is, how many praises will have been said? The only reasonable answer. This is terrible.
Use your voice.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So, given that, the only explanation to the question of how many praises would have been said is that there must be an infinite number of praises. Thus, Scott's theology is dedicated to actual infinites. So that would be my response to that. I don't think that he can deny us actual infinites while holding into actual infinites himself.
Could we start counting those praises on your view?
I don't even know what that would mean to do.
Well, start with the first one and call that one.
Well, right. Well, we could do that, as I said, with the number of praises that
and there's no reason we couldn't keep on counting. And that means every number that we come up with that is assigned to the praise is finite.
Sure, but I'm asking the question, how many praises will have been said? Not how many praises are said at some particular moment in time. So I think that, as I said, if it goes for eternity, there is no point in time when we can stop and say how many praises are being said. I'm asking how many praises will have been said total, and the answer to that must be infinite. As I said, I don't think that we can deny actual infinites in this case, whether they be from now to the future or from now to the past. If you accept actual infinites, you have to grant me actual infinites as a possibility for perhaps a temporal realm prior to the Big Bang.
Should we respond or go on? Questions?
Go on with your questions.
Yes, go on.
Yeah, for sure. Is it necessary for atheism to explain the origin of the universe persuasive? And this is for both of you. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Is it necessary for atheism to explain the origin of the universe for atheism to be persuasive?
I don't think it's necessary. I think there are a lot of things that we have to admit ignorance on. I don't think that we should. I don't think that we need to hold on to really bad explanations, which I think the theistic explanation is. I don't think that we should prefer bad explanations over no explanation at all. I think that exercising a certain amount of epistemic humility when it comes to questions that are clearly at the cutting edge of our abilities to try and conceive of, I think that we need to exercise some humility there and say that there are some things that we don't know and we may never know.
I guess I would respond by saying, for one, I would disagree. Of course, the theistic explanation is a bad one, actually. But I would also say, if we have an explanation in view that does the job, then is it necessary for atheism to explain these things for someone to believe it? No, people can believe whatever they want to believe. There's all kinds of crazier beliefs out there than atheism, for sure. However, I would suggest, when it comes to being in a court of law, or say you get a prescription from a doctor, right? Would you need to have a good reason or an explanation to trust it, or do you just take it? I would say that if there is an explanation, such as the ones I've offered and many others, that I think even if atheism can't explain something, they ought to at least respond to it, to the Christian premise with an equal or better explanation for it to hold. And I think to not do so, to say that the answer will come because we don't believe that Christianity or theism provide the rational basis, I think is to hold to a naturalism of the gaps, to say that naturalism will explain these things. So that's how I answer.
Mr. Schieber, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Okay, listen, you, and I apologize for misquoting, you were talking faster than I could type or think, frankly. A personal clause has to act within a context of time. It cannot act as a creator of time. I'm not going to ask a specific question about it again. I was having a difficult time tracking with what you were saying then. I don't know how much time we kind of have left, but I'd like you to lay that argument out again for me. Okay. And then, Scott, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, Scott, if you can respond just like real brief. I'd like to hear that piece of the argument again, and then if you could do a response. And I'll take the answer from my seat so I can take some more notes. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so my argument against the personal creator acting in a timeless state to bring about time was that personal creators cause events with two kinds of intention. There's either the intention to maintain states of affairs, or like if you're hanging or something and you're grasping onto something to not fall, right? That would be a maintenance of that you continually want to hold on to that. So you're acting, but you're maintaining that state of affairs of you holding on. There's that kind of cause, and then there's the cause of changing the state of affairs, right? Like two states of affairs, one prior to change and one with the change actualized. But with intentional change, there's three states of affairs that need to be accounted for, and that is agent desiring to instantiate change, agent beginning to do such a change, and the change actually occurring. These are three moments that require temporal relations between each one of them. The problem, of course, is that prior to the universe, we have two moments being temporally related without a context of time. It's completely incoherent.
I will respond by saying time, the philosophy of time, what time is by definition, is the comparison of change between actions in matter, among matter. We talk about time as by comparing states of affairs between things that exist in matter. God could exist eternally, an immaterial being, without interacting with matter. The moment God first interacts with matter is the initiation of what we call time, which is what we call the Big Bang. So I don't see a problem.
Well, I don't think that we need to presume that time only works with in space-time. What I'm saying is that there's an alternate version of time. What it means to be timeless, theologically speaking, is that it must be outside of time in the sense that it does not experience temporal succession, and it does not exist at any point or location in time. And I don't think that requires the existence of a universe necessarily. I think that God could exist with temporal succession prior to the physical version of time, right? And that's what I'm claiming, is that God, if He is the creator of the universe, at the very least must experience temporal succession, which means that God is not timeless and therefore cannot be the Christian God.
Just briefly, I would say, sure, I will agree in part that however existence was marked in the Godhead prior to the Big Bang, prior to the creation of man, however that was marked, sure, I would agree there could be some way to look at that as some sense of time. But when we say God is timeless, we're referring to the time that humans are familiar with, which is the time that came into being in the Big Bang. So I don't see that as a reliability.
Well, right, but as I said, to be timeless, it means that you don't exist at any point or location in time, and this is important, that you don't experience temporal succession. I'm claiming here that God, if He's an intentional creator of the universe, of a realm of time, then He must also exist in a kind of God time, where there is temporal succession, where God experiences one moment after another moment after another moment. That is absolutely necessary for Him to be an intentional creator. And therefore, if the Christian God is timeless in the sense that He does not experience temporal succession, then that's not compatible with an intentional creator of the universe.
I would just say that I think we're talking about two different senses of time.
Right, but I think that's not a problem, right?
Okay.
But, all right,
Leave it there.
Thank you. On the basis of not ruling out supernatural, in a moral instance, as in many examples in the Old Testament, where we have God commanding other people to kill, would you kill another human being if you thought that the supernatural God was telling you to? And if not, how would you determine whether it was supernatural or psychotic?
Would I, referring to the Old Testament commands,
Yes.
to kill the Canaanites or whatever?
Yeah, well, in Abraham, telling Isaac that Moses being ordered to kill the
Sure. That's a good question. If I believed that I had that kind of instruction, yeah, I would question it. I would not do something based on that without seeking other people's opinions. And that, things like killing someone, taking an act like that, I think is outside the realm, the kind of thing that God would order an individual to do. Certainly today. The kinds of things that happen in the Old Testament are a bit of different situation, especially the extinction of not something he held merely against some people and not against others. He held us against all equally. I'm not sure what we'd say if we saw God not dealing with those kind of things. I think that would be more of a liability against him than to say that he did.
I have a problem with the remark about whether or not, or that Mike posed, that what if God had commanded you to kill someone, then you would be very skeptical of whether that was God or whether that was, whatever the source would be. I don't know why one would be skeptical that that might be God. Clearly there's a historical precedent, if we take the Bible as being historical, that God sometimes does kill. And if we're going to be skeptical of that, that seems to be inconsistent with the idea that, in his response to my problem of evil, that we need to be skeptical about what God would have reasons to do and what he wouldn't do. Because it sure seems that Scott admits a kind of, he has to remain some kind of adherence toward the vast majority of goods that God might have reasons to act towards. Because that's what justifies, in his view, the seemingly gratuitous evils being justified by God. I don't see any reason to think that God might have a morally sufficient reason to command Scott to kill someone. And if Scott's going to remain agnostic on the reasons that Charles Rothenberg lit his own son on fire, if he's going to allow that to be a reason that is mysterious, that God might have a reason to be able to do that, and I think that Scott must also say that yes, he would act on God's demand of him to kill someone, because he must admit that God might have morally sufficient reasons to do so.
I would say the question is not, does God have morally sufficient reasons to order the things that he says? My issue was whether that was actually God. The reason the basis for that would be, since Jesus, the message of the gospel has been about saving people, not killing people. It has been about spreading the message of the gospel, about making disciples. And also when God, it says that if we receive what we believe our message is, people who come with a different gospel, a different message, something they claim to be coming from God, that we ought to check it out against the Bible, because God will not contradict himself. And I don't see any basis to expect God to give those kind of personal commands, certainly when they contradict what we see about his character.
Well, clearly that's not a contradiction of what we see about his character. That's, like I've said, a historical precedent if we grant the Bible as history. And yeah, I would just keep continuing that point of, if we're going to remain agnostic as to whether God has justification for allowing a person to light their child on fire, then we have to grant precedent that it may be that God is commanding you to kill. Otherwise, you also have to succeed, or you also have to concede that perhaps some of the visions you're talking about during the resurrection days were not really God, because maybe that's inconsistent with his character.
I have a question for Justin. Given your atheistic belief with materialism, how do you explain the fine-tuning of the universe and the complexity in the human body of DNA?
The fine-tuning of the universe?
Yeah, with just material causes.
Okay, yeah. So the fine-tuning of the universe, that there are certain, I'm assuming you're talking about the cosmological constants being fine-tuned to a particular thing to give rise to life. My response to that would be any universe, any actual set of tuned constants is going to have an equally improbability than all the other possibilities. So when we think about that, then we have to realize that improbability alone isn't enough to be suspicious that a designer is at hand. What we would need to be justified in inferring a designer from this is improbability, contingency, that it wasn't necessary, right? So it was contingent, and also that it has some kind of significance. So in the sense that if you were dealt a full house by a friend, and people started accusing your friend of stacking the deck, they might be warranted in that, but the only reason that they would be warranted in that is because a full house is special, given the context of poker. If you were given a 2 of 3 8 and a 9 and, whatever, that of course is as improbable as a full house, but it's not significant because it's not significant within the context of poker. So for the fine-tuning argument to pass, I think what needs to be claimed is that humanity is significant objectively in the universe, and I don't think there's any good reason to think that that is the case. With complexity of the human body, I don't think that complexity alone establishes a designer either. For instance, snowflakes. I don't think anybody really thinks that snowflakes are being made in some factory in the North Pole, for instance.
So, in your human experience, when you see things, that are designed, such as the table you're sitting at, do you suppose it happened by chance, or?
No. Like I said, when those three things that I would want to meet before I'm suspicious of an agent is improbability, contingency, and that it's special or it has some significance, right? Now, tables, of course, we know that agents exist that have the capabilities of building tables, and we know that agents exist who would have a desire to make a table because there is some use to tables, as in elevating my stuff at arm's length. That, I think, is why positing a human to explain the existence of this table is a reasonable explanation. But if we want to explain the existence of humans, I think that we have much better scientific explanations for why humans are the particular way they are. Not to mention the fact that our eyes, for example, are really quite terrible designs. And if we want to posit a all-intelligent, all-powerful creator, surely we would have a better design.
Scott, you had a comment?
Yeah, I'll just offer a few things just in response. This will be a long discussion, but just for this part, as always could be. You talk about improbability, and you mentioned all these possible poker hands, and maybe you've got a friend who slipped you a good hand. To apply that to the universe, who's the friend dealing with cards? I think that's a problem. I think to say, in dealing with it being not special, I think it's a little odd to say that the table is a special thing because we can see that it was created by an agent, but that humans wouldn't be equally likely, if not infinitely more likely to be created by an agent. Lastly, eyes being bad designs. I've gotten a lot of furniture from things like IKEA or knockoffs of IKEA that are horrible designs, but I never get something with too many parts or too few instructions and figure, well, this doesn't make sense, so obviously it didn't have a design.
But you wouldn't. Okay, so for instance, if we talk about the human eye, clearly the purpose here is that if God created it, He's trying to give us really good vision. The problem is, of course, is that we all have a blind spot in our eyes. We don't know this because it's really difficult to see, but there's ways to show you that we do actually have a blind spot. And the reason is because the optic nerve goes directly across our line of vision. This kind of design is actually quite terrible. And there's actually animals, non-human animals in the wild that have eyes where that problem doesn't exist. So if anything, it appears that that humanity as a creation, it couldn't be seen as maybe the primary reason for creation if He cares to give other animals better designed eyes than humanity, it seems.
I would just say I don't think that argument follows because not only with a blind spot, but we also are unable to see behind us as well. So we can always point to problems, but that doesn't mean that there are there's no design behind it.
I have a question for Scott. So do you believe as God as intelligent design and a personal God? And do you reject the notion of evolution by natural selection?
You said intelligent design and personal God. Personally, yes, I believe that creation is a more compelling explanation than evolution. However, even if you do want to talk about evolution, we're talking about, again, it's my personal opinion, there are going to be other opinions. I don't think any of them speak to whether God exists. I think those are all issues of how we chose to do things.
But evolution by natural selection, it doesn't need a God to create everything. It's the laws of the universe.
But actually, that's not correct. Darwinistic evolution offers a possible explanation for change. It says nothing at all about origins. So you can need somebody to flip the switch on.
Well, I mean, yeah, the Big Bang, like that's. But after that, though, you don't need intelligent design to run everything.
It feels kind of like you're saying we don't need somebody to, provide all the ingredients to make a cake, or go to the store and that. Once we have all those ingredients, it's not surprising that a cake would happen.
No, but like over billions of years, natural selection, it creates like the thing that survives.
If that were the case, though, what started it all? That's my question. The evolution, Darwinistic evolution does not account for everything.
So what evolution do you believe in? Just like intelligent design and a personal God? How is that compatible?
I don't believe in that. I've heard people that do believe in that and speak quite persuasively about it, not to persuade me, but that's certainly a position within Christianity.
What do you believe in personally?
I believe that God created over whatever the period of time was and however He did it. All that I am saying is God created, He did it. We don't know how, when, or how long it took, but He did it. From nothing, I should add, which is an important issue.
Hi, my name is Alex, and I just want to thank Justin and Scott for accepting my Facebook friend request. So that I could get back to you with further detail after I ask this very brief one-sentence question. You talked about evil. This question is for both of you. Do you believe in objective morality in the sense that moral, objective truths are true for all of us at all times and in all ways? If so, how do you ground that in something that can apply that objective morality meaningfully to all of us?
Good question. Sure, and give me the easy part. Do I believe in objective morality? Yes. On what do I ground it? The person of God.
Okay, this is a long question, and it almost deserves its own debate. But here's how I am a moral realist. I do accept that sentences about moral values do refer to things that exist. I think that moral values are relational properties. I think that all value is a relational property. It's a description that we describe a relationship with value terms. So something like, I desire to not feel pain, and I stub my toe. I describe the relationship between my desire to not feel pain and the fact that I'm stubbing my toe. There's a relationship there, and I describe that relationship in a negative sense, right? Because that the desire is being thwarted. Now, of course, that isn't moral necessarily. So there still remains the question of how we distinguish between general value terms, right, and moral value terms. Well, I think that the distinction here is while generic value terms relate desires to states of affairs, I think that moral value terms are specific kinds of those, and they refer to relationships between desires and very specific kinds of states of affairs, other desires. So moral value terms, I'm arguing, is a relationship between some desire and its tendency in other desires. So to the degree that desire A tends to fulfill other desires, to that degree, I think that we have good reason to call that a good desire in that generic value sense, right? And so it's a desire that we have all good reasons to promote, because we are all potential benefactors of such a thing. And for desires like rape that clearly tend to thwart desires, we can see that as a kind of as clearly a tendency to thwart desires, and that gives us all reason to condemn such things. So I'm a moral realist in the sense that I believe that morals exist as objective relationships. As in, if you would tell me that the desire to rape tends, all things being equal, tends to fulfill desires, I think it's a debate we can have, and I think that I would, of course, disagree with you as to the tendency of such a desire. But I think that that's an objective fact that we can be wrong or right about, and we can debate about. And that's a
talked about this on Facebook and whatever for quite some time. This is a long topic. If you want to talk about it more, start throwing it all. And I'm sure it'll chime in.
Thanks.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming out and people who asked questions, and if you would please give a round of applause for Scott and Justin,